Mideast Realities, a unique half-hour highlighting the real Middle East. It is a program of information that government and media often misrepresent or just don't want you to know. Get the news without bias. Facts without distortion. And most importantly, analysis from the experts. With your host and chairman of the Committee on the Middle East, Mertv Svhs Sd. Each week, this program will feature an interview, discussion, or an event to help viewers understand the complex situation in today's Middle East, and especially the realities of U.S. policies toward that crucial region of the world. Mideast Realities.
I'm Mertv Svhs Sd, your host for Mideast Realities. Edward Said is one of the most profound thinkers, writers, and commentators of our time. One of the most influential humanists of our generation is how he is introduced in just a few moments. He also happens to be Palestinian. Born in Jerusalem, Said's family fled to Cairo when the civil war between Jews and Arabs broke out in British Mandate Palestine after World War II. Then, as a boy, he came to the United States. Said is one of the best-known professors at Columbia University, where he holds a distinguished and endowed chair in English comparative literature. As you will hear in the upcoming introduction, he has held nearly every major fellowship known to man or beast, and has delivered some 27 endowed lectures. Said is in demand throughout the world at major universities, not only in the field of literature, but as a social critic and political analyst. Though in his early years at Columbia, Said was not greatly politically involved, he became more and more so in the 70s and 80s. He was in fact a prominent member of the Palestine National Council during the time when the PLO was most ostracized and vilified in the U.S. In recent years, especially since the Gulf War and the agreements that followed between Israel and what was the PLO, Edward Said has become one of the most outspoken dissenters from and critics of U.S. foreign policy, Yasser Arafat, and developments in the Middle East region. Said's books and articles have been widely published throughout the world in many languages. Orientalism, published in 1978, is considered a defining treatise on the subject of Western cultural and social imperialism. In this series of 4 Mideast Realities programs, we are very pleased to be able to bring you one of Edward Said's most interesting and provocative recent lectures. The title of the lecture is The Clash of Civilizations, and Said delivered it at the University of Wisconsin in Madison in November of '95. What Said discusses is, of course, much broader than just contemporary Middle East events. But what he discusses is actually of considerable importance in providing the vital background necessary to really appreciate these events and put them in historical perspective. And during the lecture, and even more so in the question and answer period, Said specifically comments about Israeli-Palestinian developments in the past few years, comments that are of extreme importance and should be very carefully pondered.
There's a collective enterprise in culture which the people who proclaim the clash of civilization and cultures completely miss. One thinks of the lifelong dedication that has existed in all modern societies among scholars, artists, musicians, visionaries, and prophets to try to come to terms with the other, with that other society or culture that seems so foreign and so distant. One thinks of Joseph Needham, the great Cambridge chemist who spent his life studying China, or in France, Louis Massignon, the great Orientalist who did his own pilgrimage within the world of Islam. It seems to me that unless we emphasize and maximize the spirit of cooperation and humanistic exchange, we're going to end up stridently and superficially banging the drum for our civilization in opposition to all the others. And it's also important to remember, to give one last example of how difficult it is in a simple way, as Huntington does, to talk about civilizations and traditions, for example. Think of this book by Eric Hobsbawm and Terence Ranger called The Invention of Tradition. One of the newest fields in history is to study how traditions are invented, that they don't have the kind of long, handed-on sort of existence that a lot of people think they do, but are made up the way when Queen Victoria doesn't go actually, but is proclaimed Empress of India in 1872. There was a whole series of ceremonies designed by the British in India to make it seem as if all British monarchs, stretching back to Queen Elizabeth, had always been emperors and empresses of India. The invention of a tradition. And this is partly what civilizations are, invented traditions. So that, to conclude then, we have to look at this notion of clash as something constructed and something that needs to be critically deconstructed in order for us to understand the complexities of the world in which we live. In other words, what I'm offering is not a prescription for simplicity, but really a prescription for more complexity as more necessary to the world in which we live. But the truly weakest part, for my money, of the clash of civilizations idea is the rigid separation constantly assumed. Despite the overwhelming evidence that today's world is in fact a world of mixtures, migrations, crossing overs. One of the major crises affecting countries like Britain, France, about which I spoke a moment ago, and the US has been brought about by the realization now dawning everywhere that no culture, society, civilization is purely one thing. Sizable minorities, North Africans in France, African, Caribbean, Indian populations in Britain, Asian and African elements in this country, these minorities dispute the idea that civilizations that prided themselves on being homogeneous can continue to do so. There are no insulated cultures or civilizations. Any attempt made to separate them into watertight compartments alleged by Huntington does damage to their variety, their diversity, their sheer complexity of elements, their radical hybridity. What the clash of civilizations really overlooks, though, and this is my final thought, is the phenomenon referred to as the globalization of capital. What has happened since the end of the Cold War has been an increasing polarization of the world, not into civilizations like Islam and so on and so forth, the West, Islam, Japan, but rather the world has now been divided into two vastly uneven regions. A small industrial north comprising the major American, European, and Asian economic powers, and an enormous south comprising the former third world plus a large number of new extremely impoverished nations. The political problem of the future is going to be how to imagine their relationships as the North is going to get richer, the South poorer, and the world more interdependent. In view of this depressing and even alarming actuality, it does seem to me ostrich-like to suggest that in Europe and the US we should maintain our civilization by holding all the others at bay, increasing the rifts between peoples in order to prolong our dominance. That is in effect what Huntington is arguing. And one can quite easily understand why it is that his essay was published in Foreign Affairs and why so many policymakers have drifted toward it as allowing the US to extend the mindset of the Cold War into a different time for a new audience. Much more productive and useful is a new global mentality that sees the dangers we face from the standpoint of the whole human race. These dangers include the pauperization of most of the world's population, as in the North-South divide. The emergence of virulent local, national, ethnic, and religious sentiment, as in Bosnia, Rwanda, Lebanon, Israel, Chechnya, and elsewhere. The decline of literacy, and the onset of a new illiteracy based on electronic modes of communication, television, and the new global information superhighway. The fragmentation and threatened disappearance of the grand narratives of emancipation and enlightenment. Our most precious asset in the face of such a dire transformation of tradition and of history is the emergence of a sense of community, understanding and sympathy and hope, which is the direct opposite of what in his essay Huntington has provoked. Mertv Svhs says in his great poem, The Return to the Native Land, no race possesses the monopoly of beauty, of intelligence, of force, and there is a place for all at the rendezvous of victory. In what they imply, these sentiments prepare the way for a dissolution of cultural barriers as well as of the civilizational pride that prevents the kind of benign globalism already to be found, for instance, in the environmental movement, in scientific cooperation, in the universal concern for human rights, in concepts of global thought that stress community and sharing over racial, gender, or class dominance. It would seem to me, therefore, ladies and gentlemen, that efforts to return the community of civilizations to a primitive stage of narcissistic struggle a la Huntington needs to be understood not as a description about how, in fact, civilizations behave, but rather as incitements to wasteful conflict and unedifying chauvinism. And that seems to be exactly what we do not need. Thank you. Questions? I think I can't really see because the lights are too strong. Is there a microphone somewhere? Yes, there you are.
On behalf of the Distinguished Lecture Series Committee and the co-sponsors, I would like to thank Professor Edward Said for speaking this evening. There will be a 20-minute question and answer period with Professor Said right now. Members of the audience who wish to leave may do so now. We thank you for attending the lecture tonight. Those with questions for Professor Said may line up directly behind me. This is a forum for questions only. If you have a statement for the speaker, please address it in written form to the Distinguished Lecture Series in care of the Wisconsin Unit Directorate. The address is found at the bottom of all the series literature. We begin now with the first question.
Do the Israeli people who support the peace process do so because of only because of the violence and chaos that affects their own lives, or because they genuinely regret what happened to the Palestinian people and what is now happening?
I can't really answer for the Israeli people, alas. I think I'm going to turn this question into an opportunity to beat the drum of what I was talking about this evening. To say that, there's a lot of loose talk about Israel and the Israeli people and so on and so forth, especially in the days after the Rabin assassination. To talk about Israel as if it was one homogeneous thing, which it clearly isn't, and to suggest that there is a kind of unanimity at work there. I think it's much better to talk about currents and conflicts within societies and cultures than to talk about them as monolithic things. I think it's quite clear that there is inside Israel a conflict between two, shall we say, different conceptions of how Zionism's destiny is to be realized. On the one hand, you have the extreme right wing, which produced the settler movements, which produced the strange communities that themselves produced Baruch Goldstein, who did the massacre of the Hebron Mosque in February of 1994, and the man who assassinated Prime Minister Rabin. On the one hand, and these are the people who believe that the Bible gave the whole land of Israel, every place, including Lebanon and Syria and other places which are mentioned in the Old Testament, gave them to the Jewish people, and they're entitled to have them all. And on the other side, there's the other aspect of Zionism, which you might call secular Zionism, represented by the Labour Party and most liberals in Israel, who think that the destiny of Israel is to be realized by other means than messianic means of the sort employed by the seculars. And one of those means is, in my opinion, the peace agreement that was signed with the PLO. It was, I think, a Machiavellian document, a Machiavellian moment, seized by Peres and Rabin they found a demoralized and isolated leadership, Palestinian leadership, got them to sign an agreement which was not studied by lawyers or even by people who knew English on the Palestinian side. And what is in place now, this so-called autonomy, is in effect a way of continuing the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, in other words, asserting Israeli sovereignty over the whole of the land of historical Palestine, but doing it in a way that turns on the American media and says, oh, it's a great new moment of peace, it's the handshake between Rabin and Arafat, and not looking at the situation on the ground, which allows the Israeli army to remain, redeployed, but remains nonetheless, and gives Israel the consent of the Palestinians to control the borders, to control sovereignty, to control the sea, to control the air, to control security, to control foreign affairs, and to do this all in the name of peace. Now, there are other individuals in Israel, I would like to mention, people like Israel Shahak, for example, who's a great Israeli citizen. He's a survivor of the Holocaust, and he doesn't belong either to the Likud or the religious right or to the Labour Party. But he has always spoken out forcefully against the practices of Zionism, against the Palestinians, and has denounced these subterfuges for what they are. But I think my impression, as speaking as a Palestinian, is that there still has been no recognition on the part of Israeli society. And it's very difficult for societies to make these recognitions, but they have existed. I mean, the Polish parliament apologized to the Jews for the Holocaust. The Japanese have been under pressure to apologize for what they did in Korea and China and elsewhere in Asia during their imperial dominance. And I think Palestinians require the same thing from Israelis, and that change has not occurred. The acknowledgement that a grave injustice was committed against an entire people and an entire society. And for that you need the kind of leadership and charismatic vision that is very, very much lacking. So I see very little signs now that the peace process on the ground has made any important radical change inside Israel. As many Israelis are happy, everybody's happy about peace. I mean, I'm happy about peace. I love peace. I want peace. But there are different kinds of pieces. There we come to the question of definition again. It's not just a clash of visions, but it's also how you define peace. And if you mean by peace, peace between equals, which is what I'm talking about. If you want to have a real peace between Israelis and Palestinians, it has to be between equals. It has to be between people who have the same rights as was achieved in South Africa, right? Rather than a peace, which is called a peace by the media, celebrated by Bill Clinton and others, but in fact promotes the continued subordination of the Palestinians and the denial of most of their rights. So I don't think the change has occurred in Israeli society, and I think that what we are watching is an extension of the policies of the last few years given a new twist.
When Professor Young introduced you, he said that you supported, or either you're against the peace accords signed by the Labour government and the Palestine Liberation Organization. He also said they called you a humanist, and he said you criticized Jewish extremists for being against you, such as Koch, etc. However, in reality, you in the Palestine National Council, which calls for the violent destruction of Israel to this very day, you were actively taking...
What's your question? Could you just ask the question?
Well, my question is, how is it that people call you... I consider you a terrorist. How is it that they call you humanistic?
Next question.
I'm going to do something that I normally detest, and that is I may be throwing you sort of a softball question here, but I watched Nightline last night. They had their town meeting in Israel, and it seemed interesting that even those on the left, the labor representatives on the panel, talked about preserving the Jewish character of Israel, even though beforehand someone had mentioned that 19% of Israeli citizens were Arabs. And I wondered if you saw, and not just to reiterate the points that you've made in general about cultures, but do you see any specific political mechanisms which might work in the future to, in a sense, enfranchise the Arabs as legitimate citizens of Israel?
Oh no, they're legitimate. That's a very good question. It's not a softball at all, because I mean it goes to the heart of the question. Oh, is this working? I don't know. I thought I had a... What should I do here? No, because this thing is... Well, anyway. First of all, you're absolutely right that about 18 to 19%, we're now talking here of about 900,000 people who are Israeli citizens but are Palestinians, right? So they are, technically speaking, citizens of the state of Israel, but they are designated in the language of the state juridically as simply not as Palestinians but as non-Jews. I mean, Israel is a state for the Jewish people wherever they may be. It's the only state of its kind in the world, by the way. It's not the state of its citizens, but the state of the Jewish people. And Palestinians, as a result, are really second-class citizens. I mean, juridically, second-class citizens. You understand, those are different from the Palestinians who live on the West Bank and Gaza. There are three groups of Palestinians today. The citizens of the state that I mentioned, the non-Jews, the citizens of the West Bank and Gaza who have no nationality at present at all, and the over 50% of the Palestinian population which exists in diaspora as stateless refugees for the most part, right? So the real struggle for Palestinians in this world is to find normalcy. In Israel, I think there has to be a battle on the part not only of Palestinians but also of Israeli Jews. First of all, to have a constitution. Israel doesn't have a constitution as a state. And to change the laws of the state, to permit the existence in the state of citizens who don't happen to be Jewish as full citizens. That is yet to occur. That's a democratic battle that has to be waged not just by the minority Arabs, Palestinians, but by the Jewish majority as well. That's a very important change to take place. And it's very much like the thing I was talking about in my talk, where we think of France as made up entirely of French people, or England as entirely of English people. Whereas in fact those states, like Israel, have very large minorities who don't happen to be English, French, and Israeli, or Jewish in this sense. So they're non-homogeneous. And a huge number of inequities occurs in the name of this homogeneous idea, which is essentially that the non-majority, the minorities, whether they be called Palestinians or West Indians or Africans or North Africans in France, are treated as second, third, or fourth class citizens. They're suppressed. And it goes back, I think, to the idea that I was discussing here, that somehow this idea of civilization and culture ought to be homogeneous is what is prevailing. So that if you have the idea that, for example, Israel is a Jewish state, if there are non-Jews there, they have to be treated as third-class citizens, by logic. And that's why I'm against these ideas of civilizational homogeneity, because it not only implies the kind of suppression that I mentioned, but it also creates hostility between us, the majority, and them. And that is the kind of thinking I think needs to be dismantled forthwith. It's terribly important.
Do you see anything that might bring about, perhaps, I guess that you see the only way to do that is to have a serious popular movement
Yes.
on the part of Jews. Do you see any signs of that?
I don't. I don't see any sign of it at all because unfortunately, there was an interesting. Well, I don't want to go into. It's too complicated and time-consuming a subject. But I think that the main problem now inside Israel is not the definition of what is a religious Jew, because religious Jews know who they are, and for them Israel ought to be X and Y and Z. But the problem is for the majority of Israeli Jews who are secular Jews. And there, the question of what is the identity, the civilizational identity, the cultural identity of the country in a place that is surrounded by hundreds of millions of Muslim Arabs, is a very difficult problem to solve. And I think there the question of thinking about identity and of relating one identity to the other is an extremely complex one. It's being put off. Why? Well, you see it in the accents of the leadership of Israel today. They talk mainly about security, security means insecurity, and very little attention is paid to the fact that Israel has been for years, at least from the point of view of Arabs, a major source of insecurity for them. So this hostility, this cultural hostility which exists between these groups, has to abate. And my critique of the current peace process, as it's called, is that this is not a way of abating it. It's a way of simply deferring it for some length of time. But I think the problems will stay there. This is very difficult for Palestinians, for example, to accept the position forever of being second-class citizens.